The sun over Dry Creek did not rise. It attacked. It clawed its way over the jagged peaks to the east and fell upon the town like a judgment, bleaching the color from the sky and baking the very soul out of the land. The town itself was little more than a collection of weary, clapboard buildings huddled along a single, wide street of pale, powdery dust. The dust was a living thing in Dry Creek. It rose in ghostly plumes with every footstep, coated every windowsill, and settled in a fine grit on the tongues of its people. It was the taste of the place, a mixture of thirst and defeat. This was the edge of the world, or so it felt, perched precariously on the vast, unforgiving expanse of Comanche territory. The wind that swept down from the plains carried two things in equal measure: the promise of rain that never came, and the scent of fear. Fear was the town's most stable currency, traded in hushed whispers over warm beer and in the hard, tight glances men gave the horizon. Fear and whiskey. They were the twin pillars that held up the sagging roofs of Dry Creek. At the heart of it all stood the dusty Spur Saloon, a place that served as the town's church, its courthouse, and its confessional. It was here that Clara Bell spent her days, a pale ghost moving through a world of loud, coarse men. She poured whiskey with hands that seemed too delicate for the grimy work, their long, slender fingers moving with a practiced grace that was entirely out of place amidst the splintered wood and stale air. She was a slight woman, with hair the color of sun-drenched straw pulled back in a simple knot, and eyes the color of a faded blue bonnet, eyes that had seen too much and said too little. The men, ranchers with calloused hands, drifters with empty eyes, and soldiers whose uniforms were stained with sweat and boredom, saw her as little more than a fixture, something to be ordered around or made the target of a crude joke. Clara endured it all with a quiet, practiced stillness. She had learned long ago that to be noticed was to invite trouble. She kept her gaze low, her voice soft, and her movements efficient. She would wipe down the long, scarred bar, her rag collecting rings of moisture and spilled liquor, and listen to the talk. The talk was always the same. It was of cattle prices, the lack of rain, and more, of the Comanche. "Heard they hit the Miller place," a freight driver named Hank muttered into his glass, his voice a low rumble. "Took two of his horses and burned his corn crib to the ground." Jebediah, a rancher whose face was a roadmap of sun and worry, spat a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the hot wood of the floor. "It's the settlers pushing west, poking the nest. They say the Comanche are gathering near the Red River. War chiefs talking of blood for blood." Sheriff Elias Thorne, a man built like an oak barrel with a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite, would sit at his usual table in the corner, nursing a single whiskey. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a heavy weight in the room. His silence seemed to absorb the men's fear, leaving a grim resolve in its place. The escalating raids were a sickness in the air, a fever that made good men cruel and cruel men reckless. Ranches burned in the night, their flames painting the horizon a hellish orange. Women, they whispered, were taken. Men were found in the scrub, their bodies a testament to a brutal, escalating war of attrition where both sides claimed vengeance as their righteous cause. Clara would listen, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest. She had no stake in their war, no land to defend, no family to avenge. She had only her small room above the saloon and the gnawing loneliness that was her constant companion. Her life was a circle of servitude, a slow grind of days that were all the same, except for the nights, when the last drunk had been pushed out the door and Silas Blackwood, the saloon's owner, had locked up and trudged to his own home. Clara would have the place to herself. In the far corner of the room, shrouded in shadow, sat an old, out-of-tune piano. Its ivory keys were yellowed and chipped, like old teeth. But to Clara, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. It was her only voice. She would light a single candle and sit on the worn stool, the wood cool beneath her. For a moment, she would just rest her fingers on the keys, feeling the familiar smoothness, the silent promise of sound. Then, she would begin to play. The music that flowed from her hands was not the boisterous, tinny racket the traveling players sometimes hammered out. It was soft, melancholic, a stream of quiet sorrow and unspoken yearning. The melodies were simple things she'd pieced together in her memory from a life before Dry Creek, a life she barely remembered, where a mother's hands had guided her own. The music filled the empty saloon, weaving through the stale smells of beer and sweat. And, for a little while, it made the place clean. It was a prayer in a godless room, a drop of beauty in an ocean of ugliness. It was the only time Clara felt whole, the only time she felt like more than just the saloon maid who poured the drinks. In those quiet hours, with only the candle flame and the silent, listening shadows, her hands were not tools of servitude. They were instruments of grace. One evening, the heat refused to break even after the sun had bled away behind the hills. The air was thick and still, charged with a nervous energy. A rider had come through that afternoon with news of a skirmish a day's ride north. 2 soldiers and a half-dozen Comanche warriors dead. The men in the saloon were louder than usual, their talk sharper, their laughter brittle. Sheriff Thorne had organized a patrol to ride out at dawn, and the men drank to build a courage that whiskey could only borrow, never grant. Clara moved through the haze of smoke and noise, her face a pale, impassive mask. She refilled glasses, cleared away empty bottles, and ignored the clumsy hand that tried to grab her waist. By the time Silas finally called an end to the night, her feet ached and her head pounded with the echo of 100 shouted conversations. After locking the front door, she leaned against it, the silence of the empty room a blessed relief. She was too weary even for her music tonight. All she wanted was the cool darkness of her small room. She gathered a bucket of slop from behind the bar to take out back to the pigs, the foul smell turning her stomach. The alley behind the saloon was a narrow passage of deep shadow and discarded refuse. The moon was a thin, silver sliver, offering little light. As she emptied the bucket into the trough, a sound made her freeze. It was a low groan, the sound of pain trying and failing to hold itself in. It came from a heap of shadows piled against the far wall. Her first thought was that it was one of the drunks, passed out in the wrong place. She took a hesitant step forward, her hand still clutching the handle of the empty bucket. "Hello," she called out softly, her voice barely a whisper. Another groan, this one sharper, followed by a string of guttural words in a language she did not understand. Her blood ran cold. It was not a drunk. She moved closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. The fear that permeated Dry Creek was suddenly no longer a vague threat on the horizon. It was here, in the dark, just a few feet away. In the gloom, she could make out the shape of a man, slumped against the wood. He was clad only in buckskin leggings, his chest and back bare. An arrow shaft, broken off, protruded from his shoulder, and a dark, ugly gash ran across his side, staining the dirt beneath him. His long, black hair was matted with sweat and blood. He was Comanche. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to bolt the door, go to her room, and pretend she had seen nothing. To harbor one of them was a death sentence. The men who had just been drinking and boasting inside would tear her apart as eagerly as they would him. They called them savages, heathens, animals. They said they felt no pain, had no souls. But as she stood there, paralyzed by terror, the man's head lifted slowly in the faint moonlight. His eyes found hers. They were not the eyes of an animal. They were filled with a raw, desperate agony that cut through her fear and struck something deep inside her. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a man who was dying. And Clara Bell, who had spent her life making herself invisible to avoid cruelty, could not turn away from another's suffering. The decision was not made in her head. It was a pure, unthinking impulse from her heart. She set the bucket down and knelt beside him. "Don't make a sound," she whispered, though she did not know if he understood. "I will help you." His body was tense, coiled like a snake ready to strike, but the fight was draining out of him with his blood. Getting him to his feet was a monumental struggle. He was heavier than he looked, a solid knot of muscle and bone, and her own frame was slight. He leaned on her heavily, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. Every step was an eternity. The back door to the saloon felt a mile away. She glanced wildly up and down the empty main street, expecting at any moment to hear a shout, to see a door open, to be discovered. Somehow, they made it inside. The floorboards of the saloon groaned under their combined weight. She guided him past the silent tables and chairs, his blood leaving a faint, dark trail on the dusty floor, a trail she would have to scrub away before dawn. Her destination was a heavy trapdoor behind the bar, half hidden by sacks of flour. It led to the small, earthen cellar where Silas stored barrels of beer and whiskey to keep them cool. Lifting the door was a strain, its iron ring cold and heavy in her hand. A wave of cool, damp air rose to meet them, smelling of earth and aging wood. She helped him down the steep wooden steps, his wounded body clumsy and weak, in the absolute darkness of the cellar. She settled him onto a pile of empty burlap sacks in the corner. His breathing was the only sound, a harsh, wet rasp in the black silence. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do not move. I will be back." She closed the trap door, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit the ring back into its groove. Her own breathing was frantic, her mind reeling from the enormity of what she had just done. She was hiding the enemy, the devil himself, beneath the floor of the dusty Spurs saloon. With frantic energy, she worked. She found a rag and a bucket of water and scrubbed at the dark spots on the floor until her knees were raw and the wood was clean. Then, her courage fortified by the desperate need for action, she gathered what she could. She took a bottle of whiskey, not for drinking but for cleaning, a small lantern, some clean rags from her room, and a bowl of water. She found an old, sharp knife in the kitchen used for cutting lemons. When she descended into the cellar again, the small bubble of light from her lantern pushed back the oppressive dark. He was where she had left him, his eyes closed, his face pale beneath its copper skin. He looked younger than she had first thought, perhaps not much older than her own 20 years. She knelt beside him, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the earthen walls. He flinched when she touched his shoulder, his eyes snapping open, dark and wary. "I have to," she said softly, showing him the knife and the whiskey. "The arrow. It must come out." He seemed to understand. He watched her, his jaw tight, as she took the knife and carefully cut the buckskin around the wound. The flesh was swollen and angry. The most difficult part was the gash on his side. It was deep, still oozing blood, and filled with dirt. With trembling hands, she began to clean it, her touch as gentle as she could make it. He did not cry out, but a muscle in his jaw jumped, and his whole body went rigid with pain. She worked quickly, her fear replaced by a focused determination. She poured a little of the whiskey over the wound, and he hissed, his body arching off the sacks. "I am sorry," she murmured, tears stinging her own eyes. Finally, she turned to the broken arrow in his shoulder. She knew she could not pull it out the way it went in. Taking a deep breath, she braced his body with one hand and, with the other, pushed the arrowhead the rest of the way through the skin on the other side. A strangled cry escaped his lips this time, a sound of pure agony that she felt in her own bones. She quickly broke off the arrowhead and pulled the smooth shaft back out, more whiskey to clean the wound. Then she bandaged both injuries with the clean rags, her hands now stained with his blood. He lay back, his body slick with sweat, his breathing shallow. She offered him the bowl of water, and he drank greedily, his eyes never leaving her face. They were dark, piercing eyes, filled with pain, but also with a sharp, assessing intelligence. They stayed like that in the quiet dark, surrounded by the smell of damp earth and whiskey. There was no language between them, only the shared space of a secret. Through gestures, she asked his name. He was weak, but he touched his own chest and spoke a single word, his voice a dry rasp. "Tahoma." "Tahoma," she repeated softly. "I am Clara." He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, as she brought him a piece of stale bread and some cheese she had saved from her own meager dinner. She watched him. She saw the way his hands, though weakened, were strong and capable. She saw the proud set of his jaw, even in defeat. She saw the exhaustion and the pain warring with a fierce, quiet dignity. He was not the faceless monster from the stories the men told upstairs. He was a man, a wounded, hunted man. The first rays of dawn were painting the cracks in the floorboards above when she knew she had to leave him. She left him the rest of the water and blew out the lantern, plunging them back into darkness. "I will be back tonight," she promised the shadows. That morning, the saloon opened to a tense, agitated crowd. Sheriff Thorne and his posse had ridden out, leaving the town feeling exposed and vulnerable. The men who remained drank with a nervous bravado, their eyes constantly straying to the sun-bleached street outside. Around midday, the sheriff and 3 of his men returned, their faces grim. They had found tracks, but the Comanche had vanished into the plains like smoke. Sheriff Thorne came into the saloon, his dusty boots heavy on the floorboards. He walked straight to the bar where Clara was polishing glasses. "Clara Belle," he said, his voice low and hard. "I need a word." Her heart leaped into her throat. She could feel the blood drain from her face. "Sheriff," she managed, her voice thin. "There were tracks last night," he said, his eyes boring into hers. "Around the back of this establishment, one man on foot, bleeding." She gripped the edge of the bar to keep her hands from shaking. Her mind raced, searching for a lie. I heard something last night," she stammered, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "A scuffle in the alley. I thought it was just dogs fighting over scraps. I did not go out." Thorne stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Every beat of her heart was a drum of terror. She could feel the presence of the man in the cellar, a secret so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her. The sheriff's gaze swept the room, then returned to her face. "Dogs," he said flatly. He grunted, then turned away. "Keep your doors locked tight tonight." He left, and Clara felt her knees go weak with relief. She had lied to the law, to the most feared man in town, and he had believed her, or at least, he had not challenged her. For now, the secret was safe. That evening, when the saloon was finally empty, she went down to the cellar with a small plate of food and fresh water. Tahoma was awake, and he seemed a little stronger. He took the food and ate slowly, deliberately. She sat on an overturned crate a few feet away, watching him in the dim lantern light. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a fragile, unspoken understanding. She was his keeper, his only hope. He was her secret, a dangerous act of defiance against the world she lived in. When he finished, he looked at her, his dark eyes holding a depth of emotion she could not name. He reached out, not to touch her, but just as a gesture, his hand hovering in the air between them. He spoke one word in his own tongue, his voice low and resonant in the small space. She did not understand the word itself, but she understood the tone. She understood the look in his eyes. It was gratitude, pure and simple. She simply nodded, a lump forming in her throat. As she ascended the stairs and closed the heavy trap door, she knew something had shifted inside her, down in the darkness, beneath the feet of men who would kill him without a second thought. A bond had been formed, a fragile connection woven in the shadows between 2 outcasts, a woman who was invisible to her own society, and a man who was hunted by it. And she knew, with a certainty that both terrified and thrilled her, that she would protect him, no matter the cost. The days that followed fell into a secret, fragile rhythm by the light of the sun. Clara was the same silent, efficient saloon maid, a shadow moving at the edges of the town's loud, angry life. But by the dark of the moon, she became a keeper of secrets, a healer, a guardian. Her life was split in two, the sunlit world of the saloon and the subterranean darkness of the cellar, and only in the latter did she feel a sense of purpose that was entirely her own. Each night, after Silas Blackwood had shot the bolt on the front door, she would descend the steep wooden steps, a small lantern in one hand and a plate of scavenged food in the other. Tahoma was healing. The color was returning to his skin, and the fever that had glazed his eyes for the first few days had broken. The gash in his side was closing, and the wound in his shoulder, though still painful, no longer threatened his life. He would watch her with those dark, unreadable eyes as she cleaned and redressed his injuries, his stillness a testament to a discipline she could only guess at. They rarely spoke. His English was limited to a few broken words, and she knew none of his tongue. Their communication was a quiet language of gestures and expressions. A nod from him was praise for the taste of the bread. A slight softening of her eyes was a question about his pain. A touch, when it happened, was electric. Once, as she was tightening a bandage, her fingers brushed against the warm skin of his arm. He did not pull away. In that fleeting contact, a current passed between them, an acknowledgement of their shared humanity in a world determined to deny it. Her music changed. Before, playing the piano had been a solitary act of release, a way to pour out her own loneliness into the empty room. Now, it was a shield. She played every night, her melodies a soft blanket of sound to cover any accidental noise from below. A cough, a rustle of the burlap sacks, the soft groan of a man shifting his wounded body. She played with a new intensity, a desperate focus, imagining the notes seeping through the floorboards, carrying a message of safety and comfort to the man listening in the dark. She wondered if he could hear her, if this fragile beauty could reach him in his earthen prison. She played for him, and in doing so, she played for herself, fortifying the walls of their secret world against the hate that festered just outside. That hate was growing stronger. The town was a pot of water slowly coming to a boil. Sheriff Thorne's posse had returned empty-handed again and again, their frustration souring into a dark, collective anger. The Comanche were ghosts, striking and vanishing into the vast plains that were their home. The men in the Dusty Spur Saloon spoke of them not as men, but as a plague to be eradicated. Their talk was of bounties and traps, of fire and lead. Clara would pour their whiskey, her hands steady, her face a blank canvas, while inside, a cold dread took root and grew with every overheard word. Then, the pot boiled over. It was a Tuesday, a day of suffocating heat. The news came not with a rider, but with a scream. It was Martha Johnson, a homesteader's wife, her voice a raw, animal sound of pure anguish that sliced through the afternoon torpor. Men poured out of the saloon and the general store, their face tight with alarm. They found her by the slow-moving creek at the edge of town, on her knees in the mud, clutching the small, still form of her son. Billy Johnson was 9 years old. He had gone to the creek to fish. What they found left no room for doubt or debate. The boy's blonde hair was matted with blood, and a part of his scalp had been brutally taken. The sight broke something in the town of Dry Creek. The low-grade fever of fear and suspicion erupted into a full-blown plague of rage. The boy's body was a horrific testament to all their worst fears, the ultimate violation. That night, the saloon was not a place of drinking and gambling. It was a war council. The air was thick with the smell of gun oil and righteous fury. Men who had been farmers and merchants just that morning were now soldiers, their eyes gleaming with a terrible light. They cleaned rifles on the bar, their movements sharp and jerky. They spoke of a great hunt, a final solution. They would ride into Comanche territory and burn and kill until the threat was gone forever. Sheriff Thorne stood among them, his face a mask of stone. But even he could not hold back this tide. He was a man of the law, but the law had failed. Now there was only vengeance. "We ride at first light," he announced, his voice like rocks grinding together. "Every man with a horse and a gun." Clara moved through the room, her body numb, her soul frozen. She saw the faces of these men, her neighbors, her customers, and saw them transformed into strangers, their features twisted by a thirst for blood. She heard them speak of killing women and children, of leaving no one alive. It was the logic of grief, the mathematics of an eye for an eye until the whole world was blind. And she knew, with a certainty that made her physically sick, that the man in her cellar would be the first to feed their hunger if he were found. The dread that had been clawing at her insides now had her firmly in its grip. When she finally descended into the cellar that night, the plate of food in her hands trembled. The lantern light seemed weak, fragile against the oppressive darkness and the weight of the hate-filled room above. Tahoma was sitting up, leaning against the damp earthen wall. He looked at her face, and his own expression changed. The lines around his eyes tightened. He knew. He could not have heard the words, but he had felt the shift in the world above, the vibration of its rage. She set the plate down, but she could not bring herself to look at him. She busied herself with checking his bandages, her movements clumsy. Gently, his hand covered hers, stilling its frantic motion. His touch was warm and firm. She looked up, and his dark eyes were full of a deep, knowing sorrow. He saw the terror in her face, the trembling of her lip. He held her gaze for a long moment, and then he slowly, deliberately, gestured with his chin toward the trap door, then swept his hand in a wide arc, a gesture that encompassed the world outside, the vast, open plain stretching away from the prison of Dry Creek. He was telling her to go, to flee, to save herself before the sickness of this town consumed her along with him. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. The compassion in his gesture, the selflessness of it, broke through her fear. He was a hunted man, wounded and trapped, and his first thought was for her safety. "No," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She shook her head, the tears spilling over and tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. She had to make him understand. She met his gaze, her own filled with a fierce, desperate resolve. "I cannot," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I can't let them do to you what they do to anything they don't understand." He did not understand all her words, but he understood her meaning. He saw the iron will that had settled in her heart. He searched her face, and what he saw there made him slowly lower his hand. A silent agreement passed between them. They were in this together, until the end. That night, Clara knew, would be their last. She could feel it in the air, in the way the floorboards above groaned with the weight of armed men, in the chilling finality of the sheriff's promise. When she returned to the saloon, a handful of the most determined men were still there, drinking silently, waiting for the dawn. Silas was behind the bar, his face grim, polishing glasses that were already clean. She walked to the piano. She did not know why, only that she had to. It was a compulsion, a need to say goodbye to the only beautiful thing in her life. She sat on the stool and laid her hands on the keys. For a moment, she just breathed, letting the silence settle. Then she began to play. The music that came forth was unlike any she had ever played before. It was a lament, a haunting, sorrowful melody that seemed to rise from the very depths of her soul. It spoke of loss and fear, of a fragile, impossible hope, of a love that could never see the light of day. The song was for Tahoma, listening in the dark below. It was for Billy Johnson, lying cold in his family's cabin. It was for the men in the room, lost to their own hatred. And it was for herself, a girl who had dared to show kindness in a world that had none to give. The effect on the room was profound. The low, guttural conversations trailed off, one by one. The men turned to look at her, Their hard faces softened with a strange confusion. Hank, the freight driver, lowered his glass to the table. Jebediah, the rancher, stared into the bottom of his empty mug, his jaw slack. Even Silas Blackwood stopped his polishing, his rag held motionless in his hand. The raw, aching beauty of the music cut through their whiskey-soaked rage and touched a place of sorrow they had long since buried. For a few brief, sacred moments. The saloon was not a bar room on the edge of a bloody frontier. It was a cathedral, and Clara's music was its prayer. She played until her fingers ached and her tears blurred the keys, pouring every last bit of her heart into the song. When the final, trembling note faded into the smoky air, the silence it left behind was absolute. But a secret cannot live long in a place like Dry Creek. Kindness is a foreign currency there, and it is always suspect. The stable boy's name was Pete. He was a lanky youth of 16 with eyes that missed little and a mind that was more curious than cruel. He had been woken by the commotion earlier in the day and had seen the grim procession that brought Billy Johnson's body back to town. Later, he had watched the men gather their weapons, his stomach churning with a mixture of fear and excitement. He was too young to ride with the posse, a fact that both relieved and shamed him. He was in the hayloft, unable to sleep, when he saw a flicker of movement in the alley behind the saloon. He peered through a crack in the boards. It was Clara Bell, the quiet saloon maid. She was carrying a covered bucket, the kind used for food scraps, and she was moving with a furtive haste that piqued his interest. He had seen her take the slop out to the pigs before, but this was different. This was later, and she was looking around as if afraid of being seen. He watched as she slipped through the back door of the saloon. He waited. 10 minutes passed. She did not come back out. Curiosity got the better of him. He scrambled down the ladder and crept across the dusty ground to the saloon's back door. It was unlocked. He pushed it open a crack and slipped inside. The main room was dark and smelled of stale beer and old sorrow. He heard a floorboard creak from behind the bar, moving as silently as a cat. He peered over the long wooden counter. What he saw made his eyes go wide. Clara Bell was on her knees, carefully lowering a bucket on a rope through an open trap door in the floor. A cellar. He never knew the saloon had a cellar. He heard a low murmur from below, a man's voice, and then Clara's soft whisper in reply. Pete's heart began to pound. Who was she hiding down there? His mind leaped to the only possible conclusion, a conclusion fed by weeks of fear and rumor. The tracks the sheriff had found, the Comanche. He backed away, his mind reeling. He did not think, he just reacted. He ran, his boots thudding in the silent street. He ran to the sheriff's office, where a lamp still burned, and burst through the door, his words tumbling out in a panicked, breathless rush. The sound that woke Clara from her vigil was the splintering of wood. It was the sound of the world ending. The front door of the saloon crashed inward, and the room was suddenly filled with the harsh, yellow glare of lanterns and the heavy tramp of boots. Sheriff Thorne was in the lead, a shotgun held ready in his hands, his face a grim mask of certainty. Behind him were a dozen other men, their faces flushed with whiskey and righteous fury. "The cellar! Thorne! She's got him in the cellar!" a voice shouted. Clara screamed, a thin, terrified sound. She scrambled to cover the trapdoor, to shield it with her own body, but she was too late. 2 men grabbed her, their hands like iron bands on her arms, and threw her aside. She landed hard against a table, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. Thorne kicked the trapdoor open. "Come on out of there," he bellowed into the darkness. "We know you're down there." There was no answer. "To hell with this!" a man snarled, and he and another jumped down into the hole, their lanterns casting wild, leaping shadows. There was the sound of a struggle, a sharp cry of pain, and then they emerged, dragging Tahoma between them. He was weak from his wounds and the days in the dark, but he fought with the last of his strength. He was a whirlwind of desperate energy, but he was one against many. They swarmed him. their fists and the butts of their rifles rising and falling. They dragged him into the center of the room, bloodied and barely conscious, his proud body humbled in the dust. "No!" Clara's voice was a raw shriek. She launched herself from the floor, breaking free from the man who held her, and threw herself over Tahoma's prone form, shielding him with her own small body. "Stop it! He has done no harm. He was hurt. I was only helping him." She looked up at Sheriff Thorne, her eyes pleading, swimming with tears. "Please," she begged. "He did nothing. He did not kill that boy. He was with me. He was in the cellar." For a moment, something flickered in the sheriff's hard eyes, a shadow of doubt, perhaps, or a glimmer of pity. He looked from Clara's desperate, tear-streaked face to the beaten man on the floor. But then he looked past them, at the ring of hard, unforgiving faces surrounding them, faces that demanded blood for blood. He was their leader, and they would not be denied their sacrifice. His expression hardened into granite. The moment of mercy, if it had ever existed, was gone. "Get her off him," he commanded, his voice cold and flat. Hands seized her again, pulling her away from Tahoma, her fingernails scraping uselessly on the floorboards. She fought and kicked, screaming his name, but it was no use. They were too strong. "Lock her in the storeroom," Thorne ordered, his voice devoid of all emotion. "She'll face her own judgment in the morning." They dragged her across the room and shoved her into the small, windowless storeroom at the back, a place that smelled of dry goods and mouse droppings. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, and she heard the unmistakable sound of a thick iron bar dropping into its brackets. She was a prisoner. She collapsed against the door, pounding on it with her fists until they were bruised and raw. Outside, she could hear the muffled sounds of the men's voices, low and angry. And then she heard another sound, a sickening, wet thud, followed by a pained grunt. Then another thud, and another. They were beating him. The sounds were punctuated by the men's grunts of effort and their cruel, satisfied laughter. Clara slid down the door to the dusty floor. Wrapping her arms around her knees, she could do nothing. She could not stop them. All she could do was listen to the brutal, rhythmic violence just a few feet away. She closed her eyes and prayed, not to a God she no longer believed in, but to a vast, empty silence, hoping for a mercy she knew would not come. Hot tears streamed down her face, carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks before dripping into the dust on the floor. In the darkness of the storeroom, alone with the sounds of her failure, her tears and the dust of Dry Creek became one. The darkness in the storeroom was absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket that muffled the world. Clara did not know if she slept or simply fell into a state of waking numbness. But the passage of time was marked only by the shifting sounds outside the door. The initial brutal sounds of the beating eventually faded, replaced by the low, rumbling voices of men and the clinking of glasses. They were celebrating their capture. Sometime later, she heard them drag something heavy past her door, the sound of heels scraping listlessly against the wooden floorboards. It was a sound that would be seared into her memory forever. Dawn did not creep into her prison. It was announced by the grinding of the iron bar being lifted from her door. The sudden flood of pale, gray light was a physical blow, making her cringe and shield her eyes. Two men she recognized from the bar, their faces puffy from a night of drinking, stood silhouetted in the doorway. They did not speak. They simply reached in, grabbed her by the arms, and hauled her to her feet. Her legs were stiff and weak, and she stumbled as they dragged her out into the main room of the saloon. The air was thick with the sour stench of stale whiskey and sweat. A crowd had gathered, a sea of hard, unshaven faces illuminated by the morning light slanting through the dusty windows. It seemed the entire male population of Dry Creek was there to witness her judgment. They parted to let her through, their eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and a lurid curiosity. A man spat on the floor near her feet. "Savage lover," he snarled, the words thick with venom. A ripple of cruel laughter went through the crowd. The name was picked up, repeated, and thrown at her like stones. "Traitor! Comanche whore!" The words struck her, but she felt strangely distant from them, as if her body were a vessel for someone else's shame. She kept her head held high, her gaze fixed on a point on the far wall, refusing to meet their eyes. They pushed her forward until she stood before the bar, the very place where she had served these men, where she had wiped away the rings left by their glasses. Sheriff Elias Thorne stood behind it, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He looked as if he had not slept. His face was a grim, unyielding mask. "Clarabelle," he began, his voice booming in the tense silence. "You stand accused before the good people of this town. You have harbored the enemy. You have given aid and comfort to a heathen savage, a murderer of our children." His voice was cold, formal, as if he were reading from a book of law that had never been written but was understood by all. "You have betrayed your own kind." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle upon her. Clara said nothing. There was nothing to say. Her guilt was plain, her crime an act of simple, unforgivable kindness. Jebediah, the rancher whose face was a permanent scowl, pointed a trembling, dirt-caked finger at her. "Look at her hands," he rasped, his voice cracking with a grief that had curdled into rage. "So soft, so clean. Not the hands of a woman who works. They're the hands that fed a Comanche while my neighbor's boy lay dead in the creek." All eyes fell to her hands. Clara instinctively tried to hide them in the folds of her dress, but the men on either side of her held her fast. Her hands, the source of her only pride, her only beauty. They felt foreign to her now, objects of scorn. "What do we do with a traitor?" Hank, the freight driver, called out from the crowd. A dozen voices answered at once. The suggestions were brutal, a litany of violence that made her stomach turn. But it was Silas Blackwood, the saloon owner, who sealed her fate. He stepped forward, his face pale and clammy, his eyes avoiding hers. He was a man of business, and she was bad for business. "Her hands," Silas said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the din. Her hands did the feeding. Her hands played that devil's music to cover for him. "It's the hands that sinned. They should pay." A slow, ugly murmur of agreement spread through the room. The idea took hold, a perfect, poetic cruelty that appealed to their sense of frontier justice. Sheriff Thorne nodded slowly, his face grimly satisfied. The judgment had been passed not by him, but by the mob. He was merely its instrument. "Hold her," Thorne commanded. The men tightened their grip, forcing her toward the bar. She began to struggle then, a wild, panicked thrashing, but it was useless. She was a bird in the grasp of wolves. They forced her forward until she was bent over the scarred wood of the bar top, the surface sticky with the spilled drinks of 1,000 nights. One of the men grabbed her left hand and wrenched it from her grasp, slamming it flat against the counter. The wood was cool and hard beneath her palm. Someone shoved a dirty rag into her mouth. "Bite down on this, girl," a voice said. Not unkindly. "It'll be easier if you don't bite your tongue off." She bit down hard, the rough cloth filling her mouth, gagging her. Her eyes, wide with terror, darted around the room. She saw their faces, grim and determined, twisted into masks of righteousness. And through the crowd, past the swinging saloon doors, she saw him. Tahoma was tied to the hitching post outside, his arms pulled cruelly behind him. His face was a swollen, bruised ruin, his body slumped in defeat, but his eyes were open. They were fixed on her, and in them, she saw an agony that mirrored her own, an agony of utter helplessness. Their gazes locked across the space that separated them, a silent, desperate connection in the midst of the chaos. Behind her, she was dimly aware of the piano. It stood in the corner, a silent, hulking shadow, its keys shrouded in gloom. It was a dark, silent witness to the destruction of the very hands that had given it a voice. "Let's start with the little one," Jebediah said, his voice thick with anticipation. He grabbed her pinky finger, his calloused thumb pressing down on her knuckle, pinning it to the bar. Sheriff Thorne picked up a heavy wooden mallet from behind the counter, the kind used for tapping kegs. He raised it high. Clara's world narrowed to a single point of unbearable focus, the pressure on her finger, the dark shape of the mallet against the light, and Tahoma's eyes. She held his gaze, drawing a strange, inexplicable strength from his shared torment. She would not scream. She would not give them the satisfaction. She braced herself, her body trembling, her jaw clenched so tight she thought it would break. The mallet came down. The sound was a sickening wet crack, a sound that was louder than a gunshot in the silent room. A white-hot, blinding explosion of pain shot up her arm, so intense it stole her breath and made the world go black at the edges. A strangled sob escaped her throat, muffled by the rag. She could feel the bone grate, the delicate structure of her finger giving way completely. Tears streamed from her eyes, but she did not scream. She kept her gaze fixed on Tahoma, whose own body had jerked as if he had taken the blow himself. A low, guttural sound of rage and despair was torn from his chest. They moved to the next finger. Again the pressure, the anticipation. Again the mallet rose and fell. Again the sickening crack and the bolt of pure, unadulterated agony. Her body convulsed, a wild, animal reflex against the torment. But the men held her down. Through the shimmering haze of her tears, she watched as they methodically, deliberately, destroyed her hand, one finger at a time. The ring finger, the middle, the thumb. Each blow was a fresh wave of nausea and blinding pain, a fresh descent into a hell she had never imagined. When they were done with the left hand, it was a mangled, swollen ruin. They let it go, and it flopped uselessly at her side. Then they grabbed her right. She tried to fight, a last, desperate surge of will, but her strength was gone. The world was a blur of sweat and tears and the leering faces of the crowd. She could feel her consciousness slipping away, her mind trying to flee a body that could no longer endure. They broke the first finger of her right hand, then the second. She held on, biting the rag, her gaze still locked with Tahoma's. She could see the tears tracking through the blood and dirt on his face. She was doing this for him. She was taking this for him. They raised the mallet for the third time on her right hand. As it began to fall, her vision finally dissolved into a swirling vortex of blackness. Her last conscious thought was of his name, Tahoma. Then, mercifully, she collapsed, sliding from the men's grasp into a heap on the dusty floor, unconscious before the final blows fell. That night, the town of Dry Creek exacted its final price. As dusk settled, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, the men dragged Tahoma from the hitching post to the great cottonwood tree that stood by the town well. Its branches were thick and strong, a silent sentinel that had witnessed the town's entire brief, brutal history. They did not give him a trial. They did not offer him a prayer. They threw a rope over a high branch, fashioned a hangman's knot, and fitted it around his neck. A crowd gathered to watch, their faces grim in the flickering torchlight. It was a somber, ugly affair. Their earlier rage had been spent on Clara, leaving only a cold, methodical need to finish the job. The deed was done quickly. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the soft, mournful creak of the rope in the wind. They left him there, a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky, a warning to any who would challenge the town's bloody code. But the night was not done with its secrets. Before the first hint of dawn, a deep, moonless dark fell over the plains. A wind rose up, whispering through the cottonwood leaves, a sound like 1,000 mournful voices. When the sun finally rose, casting its pale, impartial light on the town, the rope was empty. It swayed gently in the morning breeze. Its frayed knot, a silent question. Tahoma's body was gone. Panic, quiet and cold, trickled through the town. There were no tracks, no signs of a struggle. It was as if he had simply vanished. Some of the more superstitious folk whispered that his people had come for him, spirit walkers who moved without leaving a trace and had taken him back to the earth. Others, staring at the empty rope with wide, frightened eyes, claimed the land itself, ancient and angry, had reclaimed its own. The certainty of their vengeance was gone, replaced by a gnawing, supernatural fear. The ghost of the man they had killed now seemed more powerful than the man himself. Clara woke to pain. It was a dull, throbbing, immense reality that consumed her entire being. She was in her own small bed above the saloon, the thin mattress a poor comfort. The pale morning light filtered through her grimy window. She turned her head and saw her hands. They were resting on the blanket, swaddled in clumsy, thick bandages of what looked like torn bed sheets. They were monstrous, useless lumps at the ends of her arms. The memory of what had happened returned in a dizzying, nauseating rush. The faces, the sounds, the shattering of bone. A dry, ragged sob escaped her throat. The door to her room creaked open. It was Silas Blackwood. He stood in the doorway, holding a small pouch of coins, his face a mixture of pity and unease. "Clara," he said, his voice low. "I am sorry for what happened." He did not sound sorry. He sounded afraid. "You cannot stay here. You cannot work. The men, they will not have you serving them." He placed the pouch on the small table by her bed. "This is what I owe you, and a little extra. It should be enough to get you to the next town." He backed out of the room, eager to be gone. "I need you gone by sundown." The door clicked shut, leaving her in silence. Fired. Cast out. She had known it was coming. Slowly, painfully. She managed to sit up, her whole body screaming in protest. Every small movement was an ordeal. She eventually got to her feet and, moving like an old woman, she made her way down the stairs. The saloon was empty, save for the lingering ghosts of the day before. The morning sun illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. She walked through the silent room, her bare feet cold on the floorboards. The town outside was quiet, unnaturally so. She wandered out into the main street. People saw her. They averted their eyes, turned away, or crossed the street to avoid her. She was a pariah, a living reminder of the town's own brutality. She was a ghost, haunting the scene of her own demise. Her aimless wandering eventually led her back to the saloon. She did not know why she had come back. There was nothing for her here. But something drew her to the corner of the room, to the silent, waiting piano. She sat on the worn stool. For a long moment, she just looked at the yellowed keys, her sanctuary, her voice, her only friend in this desolate place, with a surge of desperate, foolish hope. She raised her bandaged right hand. It was a clumsy, heavy thing, swollen and numb. With an immense effort of will, she tried to extend her index finger, tried to press a single key. An excruciating, fiery pain shot through her hand and up her arm, so sharp it made her gasp. Her finger would not obey. It was a broken, useless thing. She tried again, with another finger, then with her other hand, but the result was the same: pain and a sickening lack of response. She could not press a single key. She could not make a single note. The connection between her soul and the music was severed. The melody, the only thing that had ever truly belonged to her, had died with her hands. A wave of despair so profound it was like drowning washed over her. It was all gone. Her work, her place in the world, her music, and him. They had killed him, all for a single stupid act of kindness. She laid her forehead against the cool, smooth wood above the keyboard, and the tears she had refused to shed for the mob finally came. They were not loud, hysterical sobs, but a silent, wrenching grief that shook her entire frame. Alone in the dusty, empty saloon, surrounded by the ruins of her life, she whispered his name into the silence, a prayer to a man who could no longer hear. Tahoma. The name hung in the air, a fragile, aching question. A part of her refused to believe he was truly gone. She wondered if the whispers were true. She wondered, against all reason and all hope, if he still breathed somewhere out on the vast, indifferent plains. The weeks that followed were a season of ghosts. The ghost of Tahoma, whose body had vanished from the hanging tree, haunted the town's nights. The ghost of little Billy Johnson haunted its days. And Clara Bell became a ghost herself, a pale, silent specter moving on the fringes of a community that no longer saw her as one of its own. With the few coins Silas Blackwood had given her, she had taken over a tiny, abandoned line shack on the desolate edge of town. It was little more than a single room with a dirt floor and a roof that wept with every rare shower. The wind moaned constantly through the cracks in the walls. It was a place for forgotten things, and she fit in perfectly. Time in Dry Creek resumed its old, harsh rhythm, but beneath the surface, nothing was the same. An uneasy quiet settled over the town, the kind of quiet that follows a fever, leaving the patient weak and wary. The men drank less, their boisterousness replaced by a grim, watchful silence. They spoke in low tones, and their eyes were always scanning the vast, empty horizon, looking for a threat they could no longer define. The mystery of Tahoma's disappearance was a festering wound. It had robbed them of their victory, leaving a residue of fear and superstition that clung to the town like its ever-present dust. For Clara, each day was a mountain of pain. Her hands had healed, but it was a cruel and imperfect mending. Her fingers were stiff, twisted into useless claws, the knuckles swollen and permanently locked. A deep, aching throb was her constant companion, a fire that burned from her fingertips to her shoulders, a perpetual reminder of the town's judgment. Simple tasks became monumental struggles, buttoning her dress, brushing her hair, lifting a cup of water. Each was an exercise in awkward, agonizing effort. She survived on the scraps of the town's mercy, which was a currency even scarcer than water. She took in washing, a torturous job that required her to soak her ruined hands in harsh lye soap and scrub coarse fabrics against a washboard until they bled. She would work by the creek, her back bent, her face hidden by a worn bonnet, enduring the pain because the only thing worse than the pain was starvation. The women of the town would leave bundles of clothes on her doorstep, never speaking to her, never meeting her eye. Their charity was a form of condemnation. She endured the stares when she made her weekly trip to the general store to trade her meager earnings for flour and beans. She heard the whispers that followed her like stray dogs. They said she was cursed. They said she had brought the wrath of the Comanche down upon them. When a horse went lame or a well ran dry, they would look toward her little shack, their face tight with blame. She was their scapegoat, the living embodiment of all their fears. She had consorted with the devil, and now his shadow lay over all of them. And then the raids began again. They started subtly. A few cattle vanished from a herd. A storage shed on a remote ranch burned to the ground in the middle of the night. But then they escalated with a terrifying speed and precision. A supply wagon on its way from Fort Worth was found overturned and smoldering, its driver and guard gone without a trace. The Johnson homestead, where Martha still mourned her son, was attacked. Its horses were taken, its fields set ablaze. The attacks were no longer random acts of plunder. They were methodical, strategic, and relentlessly cruel. They felt like a punishment. Panic returned to Dry Creek, sharper and more potent than before. This was not a war for territory. It was a war of ghosts. The Comanche warriors struck like lightning and vanished like smoke, leaving behind only terror and ruin. The townsfolk lived in a state of siege, their lives shrunken to the space between a locked door and a loaded rifle. Their hatred for Clara intensified with their fear. She was no longer just an outcast. She was the cause. Her name became a curse, muttered in the saloon and whispered in the supposed safety of their homes. She was the witch on the hill, the Jonah who had doomed their ship. She felt the full weight of their animosity in the hard, accusing glares that followed her everywhere. She was utterly alone, adrift in an ocean of animosity. Her only companions, the constant, throbbing pain in her hands and the aching void in her heart where her music used to be. One night, the wind blew hard from the north, a cold, dry wind that scraped at the walls of her cabin and made the loose roof boards rattle. Clara sat at her small, rickety-cracked table. Staring at a stale crust of bread she had no appetite to eat. The pain in her hands was particularly bad tonight, a sharp, biting ache that seemed to feed on the cold. She was wrapped in a thin blanket, but the chill went deeper than her skin. It was a coldness of the soul, a profound and weary loneliness. A sound outside made her freeze. It was not the wind. It was the soft, deliberate tread of a horse. Her heart leapt into her throat. No one from town ever came to her shack, especially not after dark. She imagined a mob, their faces lit by torches, their minds poisoned by fear and whiskey, coming to finish the job they had started weeks ago. She flattened herself against the wall beside the door, her breath held tight in her chest, her mind racing. The cabin had no back door, no window large enough to escape through. She was trapped. The footsteps stopped just outside. There was a long, breathless silence, broken only by the howling of the wind. Then, a soft knock on the door. It was not the angry, impatient rap of a mob. It was quiet, hesitant. Her fear was replaced by a wave of confusion. She stayed frozen, unable to move or speak. A voice came from the other side of the door, low and quiet, a voice that cut through the sound of the wind and pierced her heart. "Clara." It was a single word, spoken in a way no one else had ever said her name. It was a sound she had replayed in her mind 1,000 times, a sound she thought she would never hear again. Her body began to tremble, not from fear, but from a wild, impossible hope that was so painful it felt like another form of breaking. Slowly, her legs unsteady, she moved to the door. Her ruined hands fumbled with the wooden latch, her fingers clumsy and unresponsive. The latch finally lifted, and the door creaked open. He stood in the moonlight, a silhouette against the dark, wind-swept plains. The horse behind him was a lean, powerful Mustang, as dark as the night itself. He was taller than she remembered, broader in the shoulder. He wore buckskin leggings and a shirt that was open at the throat, revealing a chest crisscrossed with old and new scars. His long, black hair was unbound, blowing in the wind. He was no longer the wounded, vulnerable man she had hidden in her cellar. He was a warrior, a chieftain, a spirit of the plains wearing the dust and the silence of the land like a second skin. It was Tahoma. He was alive. His face was leaner, harder, the lines around his eyes and mouth carved deeper. A fresh, jagged scar ran from his temple down his cheek, a pale line against his copper skin. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the same dark, piercing eyes she remembered, but the warmth, the quiet gratitude she had once seen there, was gone. In its place was something colder, harder, a fire banked with the ashes of immense pain. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They simply stood, separated by the threshold, the wind swirling between them. Clara's mind could not fully grasp the reality of him. He was a ghost made flesh, a prayer answered in the most terrifying way imaginable. With a small, choked cry, she took a stumbling step forward. She raised her hands, her mangled, useless hands, and reached out to touch his face. It was an instinct, a need to confirm that he was real, that he was not a phantom conjured by her grief. Her twisted fingers were clumsy, but her touch was as gentle as a whisper as she traced the line of his jaw, the sharp angle of his cheekbone, the cruel path of the new scar. His skin was real. It was warm beneath her touch. He did not flinch. He stood perfectly still, his eyes closed, as if absorbing her touch like a man drinking water after a long thirst. A shudder ran through his powerful frame. Then, slowly, he dropped to one knee before her in the dirt. He took one of her ruined hands in his own, his grip incredibly gentle, his large, calloused fingers enveloping hers. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to the swollen, scarred knuckles. Clara gasped, a sob catching in her throat. The gesture was one of such profound reverence, such aching tenderness, that it broke through the dam of her composure. Tears streamed down her face. He looked up at her, his eyes dark with an emotion too fierce to name. "They hurt what is gentle," he said. His voice was a low rumble, his English still broken, but the words were clear, each one a stone dropped into the well of the night. "We do not forget." The words were a vow, a promise, and she understood instantly that they were a promise of vengeance. He had come back not just for her, but for what had been done to her. The raids, the fires, the fear gripping the town. It was all for her. It was his answer to her broken hands. "No!" she pleaded, her voice a ragged whisper. She tried to pull her hand away, but he held it fast. "Tahoma, no, please, do not harm them. Vengeance will not heal this." She looked down at her hands, the evidence of her ruin. "It will not make them whole again." She was pleading for the lives of the very people who had scorned and brutalized her. She knew their cruelty, their capacity for hate, but she also knew that another fire, another death, would not put out the flames of the last one. It would only create an inferno that would consume them all. Tahoma listened, his gaze fixed on her face. He saw her tears, heard the desperate sincerity in her voice, but his expression did not soften. A terrible conflict played out in his eyes, the fire of his rage warring with the pain of his devotion to her. He saw her suffering, and his only answer, the only answer his world had ever taught him, was blood for blood. How could he make her understand that his violence was a form of love? How could she make him understand that her plea for peace was born from the same source? He did not answer her plea. He only looked at her, his gaze burning with a fire and a pain that seemed to reflect all the cruelty of the world. He rose to his feet, still holding her hand. He gently led her back inside the small cabin and then released her. Without a word, he turned and went back to his horse. He unstrapped a heavy bundle from its back and carried it to her doorway. He laid the items at her feet, a side of freshly butchered deer, wrapped in canvas, and a large, supple deer pelt, tanned to the softness of velvet. It was a king's ransom for a woman who lived on scraps. It was food to give her strength, a hide to give her warmth. It was an act of profound care, a provider's gift. He looked at her one last time, his face a mask of intractable purpose. Then he turned, swung himself onto his horse's back with a fluid grace, and, without a backward glance, melted back into the darkness from which he had come. He disappeared as silently and completely as a dream upon waking. Clara stood in the doorway for a long time, the cold wind drying the tears on her face, staring into the empty darkness. She brought the soft deer pelt to her cheek, its scent wild and clean. He was alive. He had come back for her. This knowledge was a sun rising in the frozen landscape of her heart. But his return was not a salvation. It was a storm. She dragged the provisions inside and barred the door. She did not sleep that night. She sat wrapped in the deer pelt, the meat lying on the table, a testament to his deadly skill. She was torn apart by a maelstrom of emotions. Joy that he was alive, so fierce it was a physical ache. Terror of what he had become, what he intended to do, and beneath it all, a feeling she had denied for so long, a feeling she had no right to, but that now bloomed in the wasteland of her heart with the force of a desert flower after a flood. It was love, impossible, terrible, and absolute. A love for a man who was now a specter of vengeance, a love that was not a gentle comfort, but a wound. When the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, she was still sitting there. A new sound reached her, carried on the morning wind. A distant shouting, a frantic ringing of the church bell, a sound reserved for fire or attack. She got to her feet and opened the door. To the east, at the far edge of town, a thick column of greasy black smoke was rising into the pristine morning sky, staining it like a bruise. It was coming from the direction of the old Miller place, the first ranch that had been raided weeks ago. Clara stared at the rising smoke, and her heart felt as if it had turned to stone. His gift lay on her table. His vengeance was painting the sky. The world was slipping into a madness from which there was no escape, and she was standing at its very center. The love that burned in her chest was not a beacon of hope. It was the same color as the distant, rising flames, a wound that would not close. The smoke from the Miller Ranch was a funeral pyre that burned for 2 days, a constant, grim reminder in the eastern sky. For the town of Dry Creek, it was the final desecration. The ghost they had feared had proven to be flesh and blood, and far more dangerous than any specter. The uneasy quiet that had held the town captive shattered, and in its place rose a cold, unified fury. Sheriff Ellis Thorne became the man he was always meant to be, a leader of a war party. His face, already hard, seemed to have been fired in a kiln, all traces of doubt or hesitation baked out of it. He stood on the steps of his office, his shotgun resting in the crook of his arm, and spoke to the assembled men. His voice was not loud, but it carried with the clear, hard finality of a hammer striking an anvil. "We let this fester," he said, his eyes scanning the grim faces before him. "We thought a rope was the end of it. We were wrong. This is not about one raid. This is a sickness, and it will not be cured until we cut it out by the root." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the hot air. "We are going to ride out and finish what should have been done long ago. We will burn their camps as they have burned our homes. We will not stop until this land is quiet again." There were no cheers, only a low, guttural murmur of assent. This was not a venture of hot-blooded passion. It was a cold, calculated campaign of extermination. Men returned to their homes to clean their rifles, sharpen their knives, and kiss their wives and children goodbye with a grim finality. From the doorway of her shack, Clara watched the preparations. She saw the grim determination in their walks, the cold fire in their eyes. She knew this was not just a posse. It was an army. They would ride out and slaughter every Comanche man, woman, and child they could find. And Tahoma, in his grief and rage, would meet them with his own warriors, and the plains would be soaked in a bloodbath from which no one would emerge whole. She was the cause of it all. Her single act of compassion had spiraled into a promise of mutual annihilation. The weight of that knowledge was a physical thing, a stone in her gut. A desperate, insane idea began to form in her mind. It was a fool's errand, a suicidal impulse, but it was the only thing she could think to do. She had started this, she had to try to end it. Before the first hint of dawn, while the town was still cloaked in a nervous, pre-dawn darkness, Clara slipped out of her shack. She went to the livery stable, her heart pounding with every step. The stable boy, Pete, was asleep in the hayloft, moving with a stealth she did not know she possessed. She found a horse, a sturdy but old mare that was often overlooked. Saddling the horse was an act of pure torture. Her mangled hands screamed in protest as she fumbled with the heavy leather straps and buckles. The pain was so sharp, it brought tears to her eyes. But she bit down on her lip, her desperation a force greater than the agony. Gripping the reins was the worst part. The rough leather scraped against her scarred knuckles, and she had to clench her twisted fingers into a tight, unnatural fist to hold on. A fresh wave of fire shot up her arms. She led the mare out of the stable and into the silent street, then mounted, her body clumsy and stiff. She did not know exactly where she was going. She only knew she had to ride east, into the vast, open territory of the Comanche, and find Tahoma before the sheriff and his men did. The sun rose behind her as she rode, casting her long, lonely shadow across the plains. The land stretched out before her, an endless rolling sea of dry grass and red earth, vast and indifferent. This was the country the settlers feared, a wilderness they sought to tame with fences and plows. To Clara, it was simply empty, a place that magnified her own smallness and the futility of her quest. By midday, the world had become a shimmering, merciless oven. The sun beat down on her, relentless and white-hot. Heat rose from the baked earth in wavy, distorted lines. There was no shade, no shelter, only the vast, empty sky and the vast, empty land. Her water, in a small canteen she had managed to grab, was warm and tasted of metal. She drank it sparingly, knowing it would not last. The pain in her hands became a living entity, a constant, screaming companion. To keep her grip, she had to wrap the reins around her wrists, the leather biting into her skin. Every jolt of the horse's gait sent a fresh shock wave of agony through her body. The skin on her knuckles broke, and a thin trickle of blood ran down her wrists, mingling with her sweat. She fell. The horse stumbled in a patch of loose rock, and Clara, her grip failing, tumbled from the saddle, landing hard on the unforgiving ground. The impact jarred every bone in her body. For a long moment, she lay there, the sun searing her face, the taste of dust and blood in her mouth. The horse stood a few feet away, its head drooped in exhaustion. Above, in the bleached white sky, a vulture circled, a patient, black speck. It was so easy to just lie here, to close her eyes and let the sun and the pain and the emptiness take her. But then she saw his face in her mind, Tahoma's face, as he knelt before her, his eyes full of fire and grief. She saw the faces of the men from town, their features twisted by hate. She could not let them destroy each other. She could not be the reason for so much death. With a groan that was half pain, half prayer, she pushed herself up. Her body screamed. Her hands throbbed with a blinding intensity. She staggered to the horse, her vision swimming. It took her 3 tries to pull herself back into the saddle, her arms shaking, her strength all but gone. But she was mounted. She was moving. She rode on, a small, stubborn speck of life crawling across a dead landscape. She did not know how long she rode. The sun crawled across the sky, a merciless eye charting her agonizing progress. Her thirst became a torment, her throat a desert of its own. The world dissolved into a blur of shimmering heat, rhythmic pain, and the endless, plodding gait of the horse. She rode until she was no longer thinking, no longer feeling, just moving, propelled forward by a single, desperate idea: find him. It was dusk when she saw the smoke. It was not the thick, black smoke of a burning ranch, but the thin, gray plume of a campfire, rising into the purple twilight. It was miles away, a fragile signal in the vast emptiness. With the last of her strength, she urged the weary horse toward it. As she drew closer, she saw the camp. It was nestled in a shallow, rocky canyon, sheltered from the wind. Horses were picketed nearby, and the dark shapes of men moved around a central fire. It was a war camp. She could feel it. The energy coming from it was tense, silent, and deadly. She slid from her horse's back, her legs buckling beneath her, and began to walk, then stumble, toward the light. She emerged from the rocks and stood at the edge of the camp. 20 or more warriors were gathered there. They were preparing for battle. Some sharpened long knives on whetstones. The sound a soft, rhythmic hiss in the quiet. Others checked the tautness of their bowstrings. Many had already painted their faces and chests with symbols of war, stark, jagged lines of black and red and white that transformed their human features into terrifying masks of vengeance. They moved with a silent, focused purpose that was more intimidating than any battle cry. And then she saw him. Tahoma stood near the fire, speaking in low tones to an older warrior. He was not wearing a shirt, and the firelight played over the scarred landscape of his chest and back. He had a streak of black paint, like a lightning bolt, drawn from his forehead down across his left eye. He turned, as if sensing her presence, and his eyes met hers across the camp. For a heartbeat, the entire camp froze. Every warrior stopped what he was doing and turned to stare at the apparition that had appeared at their perimeter, a lone white woman, her dress torn and filthy, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her hands wrapped in bloody rags. Tahoma's face was a mask of disbelief, then a dawning, terrible understanding. He strode toward her, his movements swift and urgent. Clara took a step to meet him, and then her strength gave out entirely. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground at his feet, the red dust rising in a cloud around her. "No!" she sobbed, the word a ragged, desperate plea. She reached out, her bleeding, broken hand grasping at his legging. "Please, Tahoma, do not kill! Do not do this!" She was exhausted, delirious with pain and thirst, her words tumbling out in a torrent of desperation. "The sheriff is coming. They mean to kill you all, but you cannot meet them with more killing. It will never end. Please." He knelt before her, his body shielding her from the curious, hostile stares of his men. He looked at her face, at the raw sunburn and the tracks of her tears. He looked at her ruined hands, at the fresh blood seeping through the rags. A look of profound anguish crossed his face. All his rage, all his righteous fury, seemed to drain away, replaced by an unbearable sorrow. He gently took her hands in his touch so light it was like the brush of a feather. He examined the swollen knuckles, the twisted fingers, the raw, bleeding skin. He looked up from her hands to her eyes, and his own were dark with a pain that went deeper than any physical wound. He leaned in close, his voice a low, raw whisper that only she could hear over the crackle of the fire. "They broke your hands for kindness," he said, his words thick with a grief that was almost a physical force. "What should we do for that?" It was the question that lay at the heart of everything. It was the question the whole brutal, unforgiving world was asking. An eye for an eye, blood for blood. What is the price for such a crime? Clara looked at him through her tears, her heart breaking for his pain, for her pain, for the pain of the whole world. She knew what the men of Dry Creek would say. She knew what his warriors, standing behind him with their painted faces and sharpened knives, expected him to do. She knew the law of this land, but her own law was different. It was a law written on her heart in a language of mercy she could not unlearn, even now. "Forgive," she answered, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the wind, but it carried the weight of her entire soul. "You forgive." The word hung in the air between them, simple and impossible. Tahoma stared at her, his expression unreadable. Forgiveness was not a word that had much currency in his world, or in hers. It was a fool's currency, a prayer in a godless land. Behind him, his warriors watched in stunned silence. They had seen this woman's broken hands. They had heard the story of her punishment. They had been sharpening their blades, preparing their hearts for a battle of righteous vengeance in her name. And now, she knelt before them, bleeding and exhausted, and spoke the one word that defied all their understanding. They stared at her, their faces a mixture of confusion, rage, and a strange, grudging awe. She was either a saint or a madwoman, and they were not sure which was more dangerous. That night, Clara stayed in the Comanche camp. They gave her water, which she drank until she was sick. They gave her food, a piece of roasted meat, and she ate it slowly, her strength gradually returning. No one spoke to her, but they no longer looked at her with hostility. They watched her with a wary, bewildered respect. She was an omen, a puzzle they could not solve. She sat by their fire, wrapped in the soft deer pelt Tahoma had given her, a small, still figure in the heart of a warrior camp. Tahoma sat across from her, his gaze distant, his face lost in the dancing shadows. He had not spoken since she had whispered that impossible word. She could feel the conflict raging within him, the battle between the man he was raised to be and the man she was asking him to become. Her heart was a battleground of its own, divided between two worlds, belonging to neither. She felt an overwhelming love for the man across the fire, but she was a stranger among his people. She had fled her own kind, only to find she could never truly be one of these. She was utterly adrift. As the night wore on, the warriors began to sleep, wrapping themselves in their blankets. Soon it was only her and Tahoma, awake on opposite sides of the dying fire. In the silence, he finally looked at her, his eyes full of a weary sorrow. He had made his decision. When the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern sky, the camp came alive. The warriors gathered their weapons and horses, their movements once again filled with a silent, deadly purpose. Clara stood, her heart heavy with dread and a fragile hope. She watched as Tahoma mounted his horse. He looked down at her, and his eyes held a message she could not quite read. Then he turned his horse, not west toward Dry Creek, but south. His warriors fell in behind him, a silent column of ghosts riding into the dawn. They were not riding toward the town. They were not riding to meet the sheriff's posse. Later, she would piece together the story from the whispers of a scout who returned to the camp. Sheriff Thorne's posse, in their blind rage, had pushed deep into Comanche territory. In doing so, they had stumbled upon a small, undefended encampment, a place where women, children, and the elderly were gathered while the warriors were away. The posse, their blood up, had surrounded it, trapping the helpless inside. Tahoma and his warriors rode not for revenge, but for rescue. They circled back, their knowledge of the land their greatest weapon, and fell upon the posse from behind. It was not a battle to destroy, but a battle to save. They fought to break the siege, to lead their vulnerable people to safety. It was an act of war, born of necessity, but its purpose had been changed. Mercy, in its own fierce and bloody way, had walked hand in hand with revenge. Clara watched them disappear over the horizon, a tide of warriors receding into the plains. A wave of pride swelled in her chest, so fierce it brought fresh tears to her eyes. He had listened. He had chosen life over death, but the pride was mingled with a profound and bottomless grief. The choice he had made was his. The path he rode was his own, and as she stood alone in the vast, empty wilderness, watching the dust of his warriors settle, she knew with a final, heartbreaking certainty that there was no home for her to return to, not behind her, and not ahead. For 3 days, Dry Creek held its breath. The posse, led by Sheriff Thorne, had ridden out with the grim finality of an execution squad, and a profound, waiting silence had fallen in their wake. The town became a place of women, old men, and children. Their lives shrunk to the confines of their homes. They lived on a knife's edge of anticipation, expecting at any moment to hear the thunder of hoofbeats and the screams of a Comanche attack. Every gust of wind was a war cry. Every shadow in the dusk was a warrior. They were a town suspended in the amber of their own fear, waiting for the bloody retribution they had so righteously provoked. But no bloodshed came. The horizon remained stubbornly empty. The silence stretched, becoming heavier and more unnerving with each passing hour. The fear of a violent attack slowly transmuted into a different kind of dread, the dread of the unknown. On the 4th day, the riders were spotted. A lone figure in a dusty buckboard saw them first, a scattered, limping column of men emerging from the heat shimmer of the plains. He whipped his horse into a frenzy, racing back to town with the news. Doors opened. People emerged, their faces pale with a mixture of hope and terror. The posse that rode back into Dry Creek was not the same one that had ridden out. They were not a conquering army. They were a funeral procession for their own pride. Their shoulders were slumped. Their faces were gray with exhaustion and something that looked like shame. Several men had fresh bandages, but the wounds they carried were deeper than any arrow or bullet could make. They were quiet. The grim, bloodthirsty certainty they had carried out with them had been scoured away, leaving a hollow, haunted look in their eyes. Sheriff Elias Thorne rode at their head, but he no longer looked like a leader. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and seen his own reflection. He dismounted in front of his office, his movements stiff and weary, and for a long moment, he just stood there, his hand on his saddle, as if the weight of the entire world were pressing down on him. The townsfolk gathered, their questions dying on their lips as they took in the state of their men. It was Jebediah's wife, a small, stern woman named Agnes, who finally broke the silence.
"What happened, Elias?"
she asked, her voice trembling.
"Where are the savages?"
Thorne finally looked up, his gaze sweeping over the anxious faces. His voice, when he spoke, was a dry, cracked rasp, all its former authority gone. "We found a camp," he said, the words costing him a visible effort. "Rode in hard, ready to finish it." He swallowed, his throat working. There were no warriors, only women, children, old men. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. The image was incomprehensible to them. They had imagined a climactic battle against fearsome demons, not a raid on a nursery. "We had them trapped," Thorne continued, his voice dropping so low people had to strain to hear. "And then he came. The one we hanged." He did not say Tahoma's name. He did not have to. He and his warriors, they came down on us from the rocks. They did not ride to kill us all. They rode to break our line, to get their people out. He shook his head, a gesture of profound disbelief. "We were the ones with our guns pointed at their children. They were the ones fighting to save them." He did not need to say more. The truth of it settled over the town like a shroud. They had ridden out as righteous avengers and had been shown to be nothing more than a mob of child killers. Their great crusade for vengeance had ended not in a blaze of glory, but in a moment of sickening self-realization. The ghost they had hunted had shown them what a true monster looked like, and it wore their own faces. The men of the posse dispersed, avoiding each other's eyes, shuffling back to their homes, broken by a guilt for which they had no name. Dry Creek was no longer a town united by fear, but a town shattered by shame. 2 days later, another rider appeared on the horizon. This one was alone, moving at a slow, plodding pace. As the figure drew closer, a murmur of disbelief went through the few people on the street. It was the old mare from the livery, and the rider, slumped in the saddle but upright, was Clara Bell. She was a ruin, but a magnificent one. Her dress was in tatters, her face burned by the sun and layered with the dust of the plains. Her hands were still wrapped in the dirty, blood-stained rags. She was gaunt and weak, but as she rode down the center of the street, she held her head high. Her eyes, which had for so long been downcast and haunted, were now clear. They were the eyes of a person who had been to the bottom of the world and had found it was not a place of ending, but of beginning. People stopped and stared. They came out of the general store and the blacksmith's shop, their faces a mixture of astonishment and a new, unfamiliar emotion. Awe. This was the woman they had beaten, cast out, and cursed, and she had ridden into the heart of the wilderness from which their strongest men had just returned, broken and shamed. She had faced the devil they had created, and she had come back. She slid off the horse in front of the saloon, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not look at any of the stunned onlookers. Her gaze was fixed on the swinging doors of the dusty spur. She walked toward it, each step an effort, and pushed the doors open. The saloon was nearly empty. Silas Blackwood stood behind the bar, polishing a glass with a hand that trembled slightly. A few of the men from the posse sat at a table, staring into their whiskey as if searching for answers at the bottom of the glass. The air was stale and silent, and in the corner, shrouded in shadow and coated with a fine layer of dust, stood the piano. Clara walked toward it, her boots making soft, lonely sounds on the dusty floorboards. The men watched her, their faces unreadable. She was a ghost from their very recent past, a specter of their own cruelty. She reached the piano and stood before it, her sanctuary, her tormentor. She ran a bandaged hand over the closed lid, her touch leaving a clean streak in the thick dust. It was a gravestone, and her music was buried beneath it. She sat down on the worn stool. The silence in the room was absolute, so thick she could feel it pressing on her skin. Everyone was watching, waiting. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the air filling her lungs with the familiar sense of old whiskey and regret. Then, with a focus that was so intense it was a physical force, she raised her right hand. It was a clumsy, swollen thing, a painful parody of the graceful hand that had once flown over these keys. She looked at it, at the twisted, immobile fingers. She chose one, the index finger, and slowly, with an agonizing effort of will, she moved her entire arm, aiming that single, broken digit at a single, yellowed key. The pain was immediate and sharp, a hot poker driving into her hand. Her whole body tensed, a scream building in her throat. But she pushed through it. She pushed down. A single note rang out in the silent room. It was not a clean, pure sound. It was cracked, uneven, slightly out of tune. It was a broken thing, a sound of profound imperfection. But it was alive. It cut through the stale silence, a lonely, defiant call in the wilderness of the room. It was the sound of survival. Every head in the saloon turned. Silas Blackwood stopped polishing. The glass held motionless in midair. The men at the table looked up from their drinks, their face slack with astonishment. That one, single, broken note held more power than all the angry words and violent acts that had filled this room for weeks. It was a sound that did not demand vengeance or justice. It simply was. And in that moment, as the note slowly faded into the dust-filled air, something inside Clara let go, a great heavy weight she had been carrying, the weight of her anger, her shame, her grief, simply dissolved. She looked at the faces of the men watching her, and she did not see monsters. She saw broken, foolish, frightened men, trapped in a cycle of violence and fear they did not know how to escape. She looked at them, and in the quiet space left by the fading note, she forgave them. She did not absolve them. She did not forget, but she released them from the prison of her hatred. And in doing so, she released herself. Her eyes drifted toward the open saloon doors, toward the bright, dusty street outside, and she saw him. Tahoma was there, sitting on his dark Mustang across the street, half hidden in the long shadows of the late afternoon. He was not dressed for war. He was a lone, quiet figure, watching, waiting. He had followed her back. He had come to see. Their eyes met across the distance, and the world seemed to fall away. There were no words, no gestures. There was only a silent, profound understanding that flowed between them, a recognition of two souls who had faced the world's cruelty and had chosen not to be consumed by it. It was not a promise of a life together. They both knew that was impossible. Their worlds were too far apart. It was a deeper promise that they would remember, that what had passed between them, a fragile bond forged in darkness and pain, would endure. He gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned his horse. As he rode away, toward the vast, open horizon, the setting sun broke through the clouds, bathing the entire landscape in a breathtaking flood of fire and gold. He did not look back. He rode on, a myth returning to the wilderness, until he was just a speck, and then he was gone. Clara turned back to the piano. Her heart was full of a beautiful, aching sadness. She was alone, but she was not empty. She raised her left hand and found a different key. Another note, just as cracked and uneven as the first, joined it. She kept playing, one painful, deliberate note at a time. It was a slow, agonizing process. Her fingers, stiff and broken, found a new way to move, a new way to press the keys. It was not the fluid, graceful music of before. It was something else, a new rhythm, born of scar tissue and stubborn will. The few men in the saloon did not move. They just listened. As dusk settled over Dry Creek, a melody began to rise from the quiet saloon. It was a fragile, hesitant thing, full of discord and struggle. But it was music. It was a song of survival, a testament to the stubborn weed of hope that can grow in the most desolate of ruins. It was the sound of a broken thing learning to be whole again, rising through the dusk. A fragile, hopeful melody that had survived the ruins of hate and pain. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are tuning in from to connect with each other. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.